friends. This is Tabernacle podcast number 82. Sitting in with me today is Tim Burgess, and we threw John and Britton out of the building. And I am Ben Brown, sitting in for Britton. And with us today, we have a very special guest. Many of you have possibly heard of him by legend alone. But with us today is Joe Kelly. Joe, thanks and welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Joe, we're really glad that you're here. How does it feel sitting in this room? Did you ever think you'd be here in the basement of a church recording a podcast?
No.
No.
There was a time when I never thought I'd be in a church at all.
Yeah.
But a basement of a church recording a podcast never crossed my mind.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming down to the dungeon with us. For those listening, Joseph Kelly, has been a significant person in my life. God placed Joe in my life way back when I entered treatment. I don't even remember the year. It doesn't really matter. It was more than a minute ago. And Joe ended up being my primary counselor. And through his dedication to the recovery, through his methods that God really blessed him with, he grabbed my attention, I think, like no one else could have. I'm going to be honest, there was most of the time in treatment I was scared to death of Joe. And not because he was physically going to harm me in any way, although I always realized that was maybe on the edge. But most likely, I'm going to tell you that he could see right into my soul. He had a BS meter that was industrial, and he would train his steely eyes on me and ask me a question. And I can really recall it was the first time in my life where I felt that I couldn't not tell the truth. And through that truth-telling led to an entire change in my life. After leaving treatment, because treatment's only 28 days, and I'm telling you, that's a blink of an eye, and it laid a really small foundation for me. But he had the opportunity to speak into my life through his counseling and through his attendance at various meetings, through some seminars, and God just kind of kept connecting us. And he maintained for me probably the greatest mentor that I've ever had in my life. So, Joe, what's your response to that?
It's always fascinating to hear somebody give their side of an interaction. And you wonder what the hell they're talking about. Because I was there, and I don't remember any of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you were, in a typical month, how many clients or patients did you have when you were working at the treatment center?
So I was a primary therapist, so I would have up to 12 to be primarily responsible for. And then would also do large groups during that time.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but over time, I had a number of thousand.
Yeah.
Of clients.
Yeah. And so naturally, with some of the gifts that you've, been given by God, that intuition you have, that looking through the BS meter, as I called it, it's kind of like being a jailer, where most of the people in the jail are going to lie, right? They're trying to get out of their sentence. They're not necessarily truth tellers. And I think sometimes that we come in with this group of people desperate for a change, having no clue how to do it, and using all of these tools, much of it deceit about themselves. Tell me about breaking through when you realized that you actually had a gift in that. Do you know you have a gift in that?
Yes. Yeah, I do. But I think the gift really comes from being in recovery myself.
Oh, okay.
So I went into recovery having no clue what the hell any of it was about and being too ignorant to go to treatment. And was gifted with, daily interaction with mostly men who were older than me, many of whom had seen many people like me come and go, and were willing to tell me the truth about their experience. And that made a difference.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly the entire career, the truth is that my career started in the jails because I spent so much time in the jails. And other people believed, people who were not in recovery, believed that only people who had been in the jails could talk to people in the jails. And that's not entirely true.
Correct.
But that's what gave me my start.
Okay.
And I loved the work.
Yeah. Yeah. So rather than, me just continuing to build up a legacy in my mind that I could never really do justice to, you've chosen to come and volunteer, you and your wife, Linda, here at the Tabernacle, and you do counseling for us. So how many years did you do professional counseling?
Something like 39.
Okay.
Something.
Yes. So in that counseling, you had such a variety of people that you worked with. Do you believe that you've pretty much seen it all? I mean, I know there's going to be weird stuff out there, but you've worked with almost every area of life.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I did it. So my practice at Munson was largely alcohol, drug related, and what in those days was called dual diagnosis, people who had special mental health issues as well as addiction and alcohol kind of difficulties. Also at Munson, in those days, in the mid-'80s, they had an adolescent unit. And I always did well with troubled kids. So right from the beginning, I was a person. I did work on that unit, but they kept calling me down to interact with kids. And in my private practice, I always had maybe 20% that was with adolescents. And I always enjoyed the adolescents. And I still do.
Yeah.
I still do.
So what's the difference generally that would make that more?
Well, they really are, in general, pre-recovery and pre-serious counseling. Because the difference between adolescents is adolescents themselves don't really want to get better. Adults want them to get better. And so in adult counseling, that can be true. But it's more true with adolescents. So, and generally, when somebody else wants you to get better, you don't.
Correct.
Regardless of what the issue is.
Uh-huh.
Amen.
Yeah, so that's part of human nature, do you believe?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Stubbornness. So on a stubbornness scale, maybe pre-recovery, 1 being compliant and 10 being incredibly stubborn, where would have you placed yourself?
When I first came in?
Yeah.
When I first came into 12-step work,
Right.
into the 12-step program, I was probably at about a 5.
Okay.
That's honest.
Yeah.
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 I mean, I wanted to change. What I didn't want any part of was the spiritual part of the program. And I've always had a difficulty with authority. So I didn't want anybody to tell me what to do.
So you could plant your feet and drag along.
Oh,
Furrow.
I planned on doing that for the rest of my life.
Uh-huh. So something changed along the way. We'll get to that a little bit. Completely off topic. You love to read. I see you and your wife, Linda, with books all of the time. And I love that. I love to read myself. What genre might you pick up if you went to the library, get anything you want? What genre might you read?
Well, for many, many years, I've had a pattern. So I'll read, and it's broken down like I'll read about 30% of the time, I'll read fiction and mystery stories, anything that catches my eye kind of thing. About 30% of the time, I read good fiction, literature fiction, as opposed to mystery stories.
Right.
Those kinds of things. And about 30% of the time, after I was in recovery, I will read science.
Wow. That's amazing. So do you have a couple of books that you would highlight out of the thousands you've read?
Oh, yeah, boy, the science books. There's very many, many, many. But maybe one of the best I've ever read is what I'm reading now. But that tends to be an answer of mine.
Yeah.
When I'm reading.
Yeah.
It's what I'm.
It's what's speaking to you at the moment.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. In really good literature, I'm a real fan of Barbara Kingsolver.
Okay.
And her books have always really spoken to me. But interestingly enough, and sort of related to recovery, was once I sort of stumbled into spiritual growth, personal spiritual growth, I ended up finding personal spiritual growth in everything I read, regardless of the genre, which always was fascinating to me.
I am so glad you said that.
Yes.
So, what percentage of time in books did you spend in Scripture, in the Bible? I mean, that's a ludicrous question, but was it? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I think it's a very good question. Instead of answering it in percentage of time,
Yes.
because that's hard for me to.
I couldn't do it.
Calculate. So I had never. Well, my relationship to the Bible actually began in the military. So when I was in the military, the only book we were permitted to have when we were on duty was the Bible.
Okay.
And so we all had Bibles, and they all were cut out in the middle and carried whiskey.
So it was a tote bag in the beginning.
In the beginning. And I never read it, but I had my Bible. And when I came into the program, so I didn't come into the program to learn Scripture. I came in the program because I came into approach Scripture because in the program I had a fairly profound, for me, spiritual experience. And then that prompted me to play with it. And I can talk about that a lot, and then at some point, and I played with it for maybe almost 2 years, and somehow discovered that there was something about spirituality that seemed real to me. So then I thought maybe once in my life I should do something the way other people do it, because I was not known for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And which meant I should try church. And I went to my wife, who grew up in the church, and said, maybe we ought to try church. And she cocked her head and looked at me like I had finally gone over the edge and said, well, if we're going to try church, where do you want to start? And I had an experience a number of years before where I was buying whiskey at like 9 a.m. on a winter day.
Like you do.
Yeah, right. And outside the party store, there were these 2 old ladies on snowshoes. And they're going by, and I'm looking out the window as I'm buying the whiskey, and I say to the guy, who are those old ladies? What's the deal? And he said, well, those are the old Quaker women who are from the Quaker meeting down the road. And they go a couple times a week, and they knit things for the orphans in Africa. And in my grandiose way, just talking crap, said, well, if I ever go to church, I'm going to go where those old Quaker ladies go. Blew that off. Went home other time later, told my wife that story, and she said, yeah. But then a couple years later, I'm in recovery. I've had a spiritual experience. I have played around for a couple of years. My wife asked, where do you want to start? I said, I want to go where those old Quaker ladies. And we went on Sunday, and those old Quaker ladies opened the door. And, it said to me, young man, would you carry this table for us? Because it's too heavy for us. Sure. Totally uncomfortable, not knowing. Then I fold up the table and I put it away from them. And then they say, well, would you do that for us every Sunday? And so then a couple months later, I had to ask some younger guy if I was going to read the Bible, what should I read? And he recommended a Bible, a New International Version. No, Revised.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A Revised, is it King James?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's a King James Revised.
Yeah. And so my wife went and bought one, came home with it, and it had a red cover. I was embarrassed by the red cover. I thought the only legitimate ones were black. And I started to read it, Didn't understand anything. Was totally weirded out in Genesis. Totally weirded out. And I went back to the young man, and because his dad was a pastor, and asked him, and he said, I said, well, I don't understand this. This thing's, where did you start? I said, I started at the beginning. He said, oh, Joe, don't start at the beginning. Start with the New Testament. I said, well, what's that? No, I don't. What is that? So he showed me where it was. And I started to read the Bible. And I found it heavy going, very confusing, particularly in the beginning. And then, right about the 6th chapter of Matthew, I read the line, your heart will be filled with what the eyes see. And it really spoke to me because it was pretty clear my eyes were looking at some wrong stuff. And I needed to straighten it out. Now, since then, that was the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Since then, I have read through the Bible right around 15 times. Okay. And a lot of it while on the treadmill, walking in the gym. And part of that was I was trying to fit in. In those days, I was trying to fit in with the church. And fitting in meant being willing to talk endlessly about various scripture.
So it was about having knowledge or, info.
Mm-hmm. And trying to find something that matched my experience.
Okay.
Yeah. So, if we could we back up in the life of Joe and go back to just maybe a broad overview of growing up, young Joe?
Oh, sure.
This is great, and I want to fill in a little bit of the backstory because again, this is a Joe that just another Joe that just another Joe
guy.
that is a very important person to Tim and also a very important person to me as well. And I have a pretty good relationship with you as well in recovery. And part of the, if we want to call it the domino chain, is that when I first showed up at a church, Tim was a guy standing on stage, and now it's his turn to get really uncomfortable here because I'm going to give him some props. But Tim was on stage preaching, and I really didn't have much of a taste for anything spiritual. I was dabbling in it. I was hoping there might be some answers there, but I really didn't care for a lot of the people I was listening to. But Tim was somebody who was on stage one day, and I was in the church, and he started talking openly about his recovery. And it didn't hurt that he was wearing a T-shirt, some blue jeans, and work boots. And his hair was kind of long, and he had a bit of a beard. So physically, my guard was like, okay, this looks like somebody I might be able to relate to. Maybe.
Yeah, and he had an attitude.
And a little bit. But what he was saying, again, I think many of us get pretty good BS meters. And when I was listening to him, I thought to myself, wow, this is somebody I can actually believe. I think he's telling the truth. I think he's actually telling the truth. And as he was talking about his recovery, and he was just being very transparent about it, there was something in me that was being stirred at that point. I was a pretty professional drinker at the time, using that as my primary coping mechanism for dealing with life because I didn't know how to deal with it otherwise. And I thought to myself, man, there might be this guy here, he might have some answers for me. And I just started hanging around a little bit more, and then here we are, well over a decade later.
And he's my boss now.
Yeah.
Is that how the org chart looks?
It
I don't
actually
know.
does.
I don't think so. I think we need to
Sorry.
look at that again. I don't think I'm your supervisor. But anyway, but with that, Tim was a mentor to me, and then also just getting involved in the recovery program. Joe, you and I have gotten to know each other a lot. Joe is a mentor to me as well now. It's quite a blessing. And we've been able to have some conversations. And I'm always fascinated to hear about your life growing up, especially pre-recovery. And I only because there's so much of it to me is quite relatable.
Mm-hmm.
So going all the way back to whatever you're comfortable sharing, Joe.
Okay.
But going,
Sure.
Yeah.
So my family was from immigrants. My mother's family, my mother's parents came from Italy. My father's parents came from Ireland when they were young adults. My mother's family, my mother's father was a machinist. He could do anything with his hands. He had no formal education at all. My dad's family were severe alcoholics. And my grandfather died of his alcoholism. When I was in the service, nobody was surprised. My grandmother had died years earlier of her alcoholism, and she was in the city of Pittsburgh in the slums. She was a infamous street fighter.
Your grandmother.
Yeah, my grandmother. Yeah. And if we were not permitted to be with them by ourselves, my father had to be with us when we visited them. So we didn't visit them very often. But when we visited, and they lived in the slums in Pittsburgh, the steel mill slums. And when we walked down the street, people went to the other side of the street. And I couldn't understand. I was a kid. And I asked my dad about that. And he said, well, that's because they're afraid of your grandmother. And
Wow.
She was the scariest person I had ever met.
Wow.
She, when I knew her, she was always somehow handicapped and was pretty crazy. Both sides of the family were brought up Catholic. Both sides were estranged from their Catholicism. So had a lot of resentment to the church, and that's it. I didn't understand any of that. But so I grew up in a suburban Pittsburgh where the divisions were between the Catholics and the Protestants. And it was really the Catholics and the non-Catholics. But so the gangs were divided that way. And so I was always in the non-Catholic gang. But
with a Catholic background. I mean,
Yeah.
familially.
Yeah, vaguely.
Right. Yeah,
'Cause
vaguely.
my family had
But that
it.
would have been the natural association, it would seem to
Yeah.
me, but you were on the Protestant.
But my family never went to church.
Yeah.
If I went, and I went occasionally, it was out of curiosity, and some other family would invite, and I would go, and I wouldn't understand what was going on. And when I was 12, I was asked to leave the Methodist worship because we were rolling dice back under the pews.
Even the Methodists would kick you out for that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And so then later, for a short period of time, dated a girl whose father was a minister. And I tried to fit in, and the other kids didn't like me and didn't think I should be with her. And so I carried that resentment into the future for a number of years. But around that time was when I went to Michigan State, and I went on a sports scholarship. And actually, I had gotten in trouble first when I was 13, and I had been went to what was called in those days a reform school. So I went there for like 4 months. Then I went again, and it was for fighting in the streets with the gangs. And when I was in the 11th grade, I went again. And social workers were always trying to save me from me. And in the 11th grade, I had a social worker that went through all the paperwork for me to get accepted into Michigan State. And I got accepted somehow. And I think it was at a time when, at least in Michigan State, they were really, really hungry for out-of-state students because the tuitions were higher. I mean, that's... and my dad was an executive at U.S. Steel at that time. So then it got delayed, and I went to Michigan State. But when I went to Michigan State, I was trying to be different. And I went to a Quaker meeting in East Lansing for a couple of months. And they scared me away because they were highly involved in social issues. And so they were demonstrators. I wasn't ready to demonstrate. That all seemed too weird to me. But I read a lot. And I read of the old Quakers. Okay. And I was impressed, but faded until much later, many years later. So
those seeds of faith, those seeds of spiritual growth were being planted early on.
Yeah. Yeah. My parents said I was always curious about it, but never found any place that I could fit. And they did not encourage me.
Yeah. You said you went on an athletic scholarship.
Yeah.
What did you do?
Well, I was a decent football player.
Really?
And a decent baseball player, but I was quite a decent boxer.
I bet you were.
And so in those days, that was the thing. That was
the thing.
That was the thing. And I had the best coach I ever had. And I don't have a lot of good things to say about coaches in general in my life. But I had an older black man who sort of adopted me and nurtured me in Golden Gloves in those years.
Right.
When I got to Michigan State, though, I discovered that everything was about the Olympics and everything was about the heavier weights, and the rest of us were just punching bags.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but that was in the last years of collegiate boxing.
Yeah.
So yeah, how I was wondering how much of that expertise in boxing that you had was just from growing up where you grew up, and how much of it was
A lot.
coached?
Yeah,
Was it?
a lot. But so it wasn't in the schools. It wasn't a school activity. It was a community activity.
Mm-hmm.
So we lived on the edge of a really mixed neighborhood, and my first coach was a really excellent guy.
So the coach that you were mentioning that was influential in a positive way for you, I'm assuming that means much more than just boxing skill, that it's personal skill as well. Is that true?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. He was an adult who, in my family, you had to be special to count. And he was the first person, adult, that I can remember who ever treated me like I was special for just being a person. And I didn't even realize that till later.
Yeah.
You know.
So how much of that? I'm going to try to connect some dots here. I've been able to witness you interacting with kids, working with students. How much of that has helped shape how you approach students now? And if so, is that, are we starting to hit on like one of those, if you want to call it the secret sauce, or
Yeah.
like,
yeah. I mean, it's interesting to talk about because I haven't thought about it for a lot of years. But one of my favorite experiences, so I was a tough kid. I was part of the gangs. I wasn't real friendly. But one time in gym class, and I think it was 10th grade, and in the gym class, we were going to box. And so they set up who's going to box with who. And the gym teacher, for some reason, fixed me up to box with a kid that was not athletic. He was significantly overweight. He wore glasses, and he was scared to death. And I mean, my coach taught me this is not about beating somebody's head in. This is about using your skill in a way to teach somebody something, regardless of what you're doing, whether you're practicing or whether you're in a match. Even in a match, you're not in this to beat somebody's head in. And so I sort of schooled this guy pretty gently. And afterwards, the gym teacher pulled me aside. And so I got tears in my eyes right now, remembering it. Haven't thought about it for years. But pulled me aside and said, I'm really impressed with what you did. You handled yourself way better than most of the kids in the class. And, and he said, I know you don't get along well here, He said, but you get along in my book.
You realize what a great story this has been so far. Is there was a lot of tension built in some of the very reasonable resentments that you were carrying, experiences you had had. And I just think of this in a classic movie or whatever. And often you had an opportunity to be a bully.
Yeah.
You had an opportunity to physically humiliate and potentially harm someone. And you chose a different path. And that tension leading up to that, because I'm going to tell you, as you were talking about it, it's like, please say that you were relatively gentle with, please, Joe. I want that because you're kind of one of my heroes, don't? And then you told this story, and then for you to still have tears after, gosh knows how many years, that's really profound, the impact that certain adults can have.
Yeah, that one guy.
Yeah.
And you know what? Today I can't remember his name.
Yeah.
And he was a black man, and he was an older black man. And the racial tensions were high in the neighborhood. But I always had a soft spot for him. And had not connected it for many, many years. The truth is, from my interaction with him, I always took care of the underdog.
Mm-hmm.
So all the way to when I was in the service, I had all the troublemakers working for me. And the rule was, when you work for me, I keep you out of trouble with the higher-ups. You get the job done, whatever the job is. And that's still going on in my life.
Yeah.
Still.
You're here with us.
Yeah.
So Ben, let's just get the job done, Ben. Okay.
That's
my
best.
Ben, I want you to go next, but one of the lessons I'm taking out of this is some of the impacts in your life they seem pretty fleeting. It wasn't somebody who sought you out and said, I'm going to be Joe's mentor because I see something really amazing potential here, and I'm going to dedicate all of this time and effort. And I think a lot of us feel a fear that if we're going to help someone, if we're going to step in, that's what it would take, and we're afraid of that commitment. But one of the things I'm hearing, and I love this because it resonates hugely with me, some of the most impactful things, because you and I did not spend a huge amount of time together, but some of the things that you said to me I'd never heard before, and there's an assumption that I had heard them before from most people, and you were able to point out some things about me that I thought were massive flaws, and that I was desperately trying to figure out why in the heck am I this way, and what's really wrong with me. And you were one of the first adults in my life that had said, there's nothing wrong with you. And I don't know if you remember, but that you actually said those words to me. Tim, stop it. There's nothing wrong with you. You're exactly how you're supposed to be. That kept me awake for a couple of nights. And I'll tell you, being in a recovery center with the little guard nurses running all over the place, that's a hell of a place to try to not get any sleep. That's an awful place to not be able to sleep at night. So thank you for that gift. But it was momentary. It wasn't so profound. And I'm hearing that some of those had a vast effect on your life as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
In a big way. I also remember, in your case, I remember you had a real effect on me because you came from a real church family.
It was, wasn't it? It's a real deal.
And your whole family showed up
They looked good.
for treatment. Yeah,
They looked good.
your whole family showed up. It was the real church. And your family has been kind to me ever since in little bits and pieces whenever we've run across each other.
Yeah.
And it's always been the real church.
Yeah. I got nothing after that, man. You go.
Oh, no. I just, I wrote a couple things down that you had mentioned, the trying to fit in. And I know for me that has always been something that's fleeting as well. Like there's always, and I think for a lot of people, that trying to fit in. And then when you finally find an adult or someone who isn't going to clean your clock metaphorically or physically, that can be just such a groundbreaking experience for so many people. Whether it's an elderly black man who's going to teach me how to box, whether it's the tough guy in school who I know is this is not gonna end well for me, in a boxing and gym. And I was just thinking about that. My gosh, how far things have changed. My son talks about, man, I wish we could just use the real kickballs when we play dodgeball at school. But imagine like if we're lining kids up for boxing, and I'm not saying that I'm an opponent to that, but taking in there's so many of us are walking around trying to fit in, and at the same time trying to be different, trying to stand out, and we're just trying to find out where our place is in this world. And just a common thread that, as you were talking about that, that coach that you had, especially with racial tensions being what they were in that area, and I'm sure the economic diversity was just all over the place, and but being able to look at you and then teach you some of these really important life lessons. He took the time to see you, and I know that has become a theme for all of the three of us sitting around this table, is practicing seeing people, and what a gift that can be, not only to the other person, but to ourselves as well. You were talking about being able to learn how to see God, to see spiritual things in anything you read. There's that plays into when we're walking around and we're seeing people as well. When we can actually say, okay, seeing somebody as God created them to be, not seeing the flaws, not seeing the weaknesses, but being able to see them enough to be able to lend a hand and help them out. And I don't know why I keep going back here, but back to even the interacting with kids. How many of those students, they're kids, adolescents, some of us who are 46 and still an adolescent, they're just trying to fit in, and they want to be different, and they're trying to figure out who they are, but just being able to take the time to see them, and not hold their value to, like, well, how special are you? How unique are you? How amazing are you? But just to be able to see them for who they are, see some of the amazing qualities that God has built into them, and maybe just be able to help them see that a little bit. So ended up at Michigan State on a sports scholarship. There was a period of time there, but then you touched on being in the military. Yeah. Well, where was that transition, and how did that come about, Joe?
I drank myself out of Michigan State.
Okay.
And more times than most people ever get a chance to go. It wasn't one time. I kept doing it again and again. I had a real draw to low down bars. I happened to get married to an extraordinary woman who was a much better person than I ever have been. But then ended up in the military, not by my choice. So there's a lot of story to that, but in the military, I was in the military during the draft, during the Vietnamese conflict, war, and it was a time in the military when alcohol and drugs was the norm. And everybody pretended that it wasn't, but it was the norm. And alcoholism or addiction was the norm. And it was the craziest experience I've ever had. So when I came out of the military, and I was thought of as a good sailor. I came out of the service with recommendations, which is completely crazy. None of it made any sense. Because the military that I was in was brutal and cruel and racist and a class society. It made absolutely no sense to me at all. And I always had trouble not saying so, because that's been a part of my life, is not being willing to accept the reality of the way things work. So when I came out of the service, I was pretty twisted up. Went back to Michigan State, survived only for maybe a year. But then I was on the run. I abandoned my wife and children. I was on the run. I traveled the country with other gangs. Could go on and on.
Yeah. We don't need to. People can fill in whatever they want.
Right? A number of years later, with my life really close to the end, I came into recovery. I moved to Traverse City because, in my view, I had traveled to Traverse City once with a job. And my experience of Traverse City, so that was in the early 1970s, was there were hardly any police, particularly in Leelanau County. And the ones that were there were all in the Bluebird. As long as I avoided the Bluebird,
you were good to go.
Good to go. So that's why I moved here.
Okay.
With a criminal record, with a history, and came very close to suicide. The only time I ever consciously felt suicidal was I got arrested again. And I knew they were going to put me away for a long time. And I had called the 12-step program once in like 1963. And the guy tried to talk me into going to a meeting, and I tried to talk him into going to the bar. And he wouldn't go to the bar, so that convinced me he wasn't serious about helping me. And so then I kept going until 1980. 1980, I had reunited with my family after being out of their lives for years. But it's looking like it's not going to work. And I'm going to leave again. And I called the hotline.
What was what made you finally pick up that phone and call the hotline?
One more arrest.
One more arrest.
Yeah. I got arrested. There was another, related. I knew.
Yeah.
I knew.
Was it something that it was mandated that you call, or was there something inside?
No,
that
it was
said,
before.
It was
before anything was ever mandated.
Before court order.
All right.
Yeah.
But this was, if we talk about the rock bottom. Was this you finally getting to the point where you're like, I need help?
Yeah, I was in the jail. The whole thing was just crazy. I actually had this experience of like a storm warning that runs across the TV on the bottom, but it ran across the bottom of my mind. But it seemed like there was a screen there, and it said, "Run." RUN. And I had run before. And I knew. The problem with running is I took me with me.
Wherever I go, there I am.
Wherever I go, there I am. So that's not going to work. And then kill yourself. And I had never been a suicidal person consciously. I'd always been a homicidal person. I'd always been, I'm not going to hurt me, I'm going to hurt you, whoever you were. And I knew, okay, you have now reached a new level of depth. And I'm in the drunk tank, and it's in the middle of the night, and across the bottom of the screen it says, "Get help." And I knew that the help was a 12-step program. And so the next day, they let me out of jail. My wife drove through a snowstorm. The roads were closed. She drove to the jail to pick me up. And when I got home, I called the 12-step program, and they said, "Oh, we'll send a neighbor to pick you up. There's a neighbor of yours in the program." And so.
Yeah. So you touch on something that is, it's your personal story. Thank you so much for being willing to share it with us. First of all, that's a privilege. And I think of the number of people that I work with personally here, and Ben as well has had this. In fact, all of us on the staff have someone with an addiction, whatever it may be, and it manifests itself, and their family loves them, and they're concerned for them. And at any point during your journey, would have Linda, your wife, saying, "You have to get help," made you get help?
No.
Okay. And yet, Linda is a case of someone who was able to draw boundaries and have love. I'm not saying she did it perfectly, but there was an acceptance level she had. It's profound to me because it's very rare. It reminds me of my wife a little bit. But for those that are family members of someone that's still suffering out there, by that I mean using, there's hope, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely.
And the bottom that you had was your bottom.
Yeah.
And when I asked you beginning, where were you at stubborn-wise? the one challenge I would say is the amount of things you went through, and the amount of potential bottoms you had shows a stubbornness to be able to go that far. And I'm often amazed on this side of recovery. I was never before, because there's something bravado about, well, Joe got out of the drunk tank and look, here we are again. It was almost a bravado camaraderie thing. But on this side of recovery, I'm amazed at how far people can go, how deep the bottom can be. So what hope might you give a family that's dealing with this? Because I know the pain, and they come to me and they really want me to have something for them, and I really don't. I mean, I know what I would say, but I'm really curious for you.
Well, I think the reality is the person has to meet their bottom, but their bottom is never predictable. Never. I mean, it took me an extraordinarily long time to get into the program, and it's overwhelming to me when I look at how long it took me. And a favorite story of mine, and I'm sure you guys have heard it at different times, was years later, I'm in private practice, and I'm working with a 6-year-old kid whose dad is in prison for addiction-related issues. And the kid, he goes to church and he tells people at the church he's seeing Joe Kelly. And somebody at the church, meaning well, says to him, well, be careful, because, Joe Kelly has been behind bars. And so the kid comes in the next time, and he puts his hands on his hips, and he says, Joe Kelly, have you been to jail? And I said, yes, I have. And he said, how many times? And he's like 6.
Very precocious.
And he's standing in the middle of my office with his hands on his hips. How many times? And I told him the truth. Well, Joe Kelly, how could you be so stupid? And I said, alcohol and drugs make you stupid. Well, Joe Kelly, don't use them.
As simple as that, right?
It's as simple as that.
Spoken from a 6-year-old.
Simple as that. But it took me, an amazing amount of time, 25 years, from the beginning of my drinking till in that suicidal experience in the jail. But then when I went to the program, when I went for help, and I wanted help, I got it. And I got it from people they weren't church people.
Mm-hmm.
And quite frankly, that has been my experience all along.
Mm-hmm.
Who has helped me the most in my life have not been organizational people, but to have been individuals here and there, working their real spiritual growth, telling me the truth about their experience.
Yeah. So I've had, I've shared with people, and this is never a bash against the church. The church I grew up in, the real church, as you called it.
That's a denomination.
Yeah, it was. They did nothing wrong. There was a lot of very great intention, and I believe a lot of incredible wisdom there. And my experiences lent me to not being able to hear it. And my radar was focused for the hypocrisy. Very simple to find. I mean, you don't even need a radar for that. All you need is a hanger, a metal hanger, and that's enough of a radar. So, that obviously there was something there, but in that organized religion, there was a language that didn't make any sense to me, even though I knew what it meant because I grew up in it. Heidelberg Catechism, blah, blah, blah. And there's brilliant stuff written in it. I do not want to minimize that at all. But it didn't make sense to the world I was living in, right? And so there's a lot of there's a lot of self-talk amongst addicts. There's a lot of conversations we have that never exist outside of our brain. And it's a very dangerous place for me to be anyways. So with the families that are working with someone, I want to know if you agree with this statement. I will often say to them, you need to think of what logic is. So logically, any kid coming out of school these days, so they graduate high school, wherever it is in the United States, they're going to have gone through some level of a DARE program. And they're going to know that if you drink and your blood alcohol level, even though they don't know exactly what that is above a certain level, and you get pulled over, you're going to get arrested. Everybody knows that. Yet people continue en masse to get pulled over for drunk driving. So logic doesn't apply there. And that's simple to look at from the outside. But when it's your family, it's really difficult. But I encourage them, whenever the person is using, logic does not exist in their brain, period. Because you could go there. How many times have we heard, they're bright, she was beautiful, they got straight A's, they have so much, and it's like, yes, that's all true. And that's part of the pain, is watching not just someone we love, but someone with gifts that God gave them destroy this aspect of their life. And so when I say that, I'm trying to offer some level of comfort. You're looking at it logically, which is a portion of love. But
it's how that 6-year-old was looking at it.
The 6-year-old
simply, don't do it.
Yes, and I wish we could all exist there.
Yeah.
But sin, complication, wanting to fit in, wanting to be accepted, wanting to be loved, family experiences, all of those play such a role. But that bit of, so tell me, do you agree with that? That logic does not exist when the person is using?
Absolutely.
Right. And so then can we change, maybe that family could change from expectations to desire? Because the expectation, if that person slips, they've failed. And the desire, so that's a negative way to look at it when we have expectations, but the desire for them to be sober, to begin to clean up their life. When they succeed, now we can applaud. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
But also, I think, and I know that you understand this.
Yeah.
I think one of the most important things for families to recognize is that you can't get somebody well. You can't get somebody well. You can only get weller yourself. And that nobody gets well because somebody else wants them to get well. They have to be willing to face the fact that they're the ones that are the only ones that can get them well. Mm-hmm. And so protecting people from the natural consequences of the addiction has a strong tendency to make the whole situation worse. So protecting people from legal difficulties, protecting people from marital difficulties, protecting people from
health.
Yeah,
health
all of it. Difficulties. And unfortunately, getting bound up in changing your life in order to fix the other person doesn't work.
Correct.
And people die. People die.
They do, and all of us have stories of. I have some friends that have passed that I've done their funerals and graveside. That could truly say they were recovered. They recovered because they made it all the way to the end, and now that burden is gone for them. They're with Jesus these days.
Mm-hmm.
And others that I've buried that never were able to reach the bottom. And that's illogical, but it's real life, and that is the consequence sometimes. And to bear that as a witness is tremendously difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And so this notion of, man, we could go on forever, but I do have this, it's a family disease. So we all come from some level of family. And that family may not even be your relatives, blood relatives. You may be in a totally different situation. If there's a person using within that close-knit family, it affects everybody. And you said something brilliant, and I'm going to steal it, and that was, if you're not the person using, I'm going to do my best to get weller. What does that mean?
Yeah, it means recognizing your limits and where your boundaries are and protecting yourself.
But isn't that selfish? Because that's what
Mm-hmm.
okay, I get that question. It's like, no, I need to be nice. I'm talking from the Christian ghetto here. Need to be nice. And
no, that's about, so in the program, there is a short statement that gets made a lot, bandied around, and it's a selfish program. And actually, that's not true, but it's that it seems selfish because the only person I can help is me. Helping me tends to create healthy boundaries and the possibility that others can get help from seeing. But me trying to fix everybody else only makes the situation worse.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I've heard this, a number of people say that's a very selfish thing. And my response to that has just been, no, it's a responsible thing. So a drug addict, alcoholic that is finally entering recovery is finally beginning to take responsibility for the one thing they've never taken responsibility for, and that's themselves. And that may seem selfish for a while, but there's a desperation, too. We're talking about the terminal disease. You either get real or you die.
Yeah.
So that responsibility, and I say that because a lot of couples I've worked with, one of them will begin to attend meetings. And it's usually about 6 months in that the other one is going, what about me? And what I've found is when the other one can embrace some level of recovery for themselves, the weller thing that you're talking about, boosters it. And there's hope then. And but it's still a real pain in the butt, and it's really hard. And we stumble a lot, and we're going to make ripe mistakes, and unintentionally, and sometimes even, I'm ashamed to admit, intentionally hurt other people, because that's all I know. And it's really hard, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and also recovery is a developmental process. So that the process downhill is steep and ugly. The process uphill into recovery is steep and jagged with its own struggles. And so often, like in my situation, I was almost, not quite, but I was almost a worse parent in the first year of my recovery than I was before. Because before I didn't have hardly anything to do with my kids. once I went into recovery, I got real righteous, like in 2 days, and became determined to teach everybody responsibility until my daughter, who at the time was like 14, and said, "You're the last person I'm going to learn responsibility from because you're the most irresponsible person I've ever known." And wow, she's telling the truth, And so then, sort of learning how to be a parent, how to be a husband, how to be halfway sane individual, which takes a lot of time and a lot of energy, a lot of effort.
Yeah, there's a lot of intentionality go into that.
Mm-hmm.
And if we think of our brains as hardwiring, and if you've been living life using tools to get through life, and we think of our coping mechanisms, whatever they are, as tools. If we've been living that way for X number of years, 15, 20, 35, 55, 80 years, our brains are very adept at going. That's the first thing that brain wants to go back to, is that same coping mechanism. And it can be anger. It can be a lot of different things. And underneath anger is almost always fear. The saying is that anger is just fear in black leather. And I love that saying because that described me very, very much. A very angry person, and I was going to wear the black leather, but underneath it was very fear-filled when I could get honest about it. But rewiring that brain to use new tools, because that's a big part of what recovery is learning how to deal with life in a different way. It's not going to happen overnight. 5 meetings is not going to fix you. It's going to take, my experience is it takes a lot of hard work. And it's been, for me, it's been some of the hardest work I've ever had to do.
Yeah.
I mean, I would give me a shovel or a nail gun and put me on a roof on a 95-degree day. Sometimes that'd be easier than actually having to deal with what's going on.
I can attest to that because, I can read Ben really well. And there's been some times he's come in to the office and looks like a worn dog. And it wasn't because he had been shoveling concrete. It because you were doing hard work. And I'm really proud of you for doing that, by the way. I don't know if I've ever told you that.
Yeah, you tell me that once in a while. Appreciate that.
Well, when I was around 10 years in the program, and I was a part of a church, and I was living different, and I had a new career, excuse me, and I had been sent by Munson to go to get my graduate degree, et cetera, et cetera. We were at a after church sometime, some gathering, and my back was turned to my wife, who was near me, and I heard another woman ask my wife, "How in the world did you stay with him? In those years, he was really crazy." And my wife said, the day he got arrested, and the next day he went to AA, I was already had a plan in place to leave 1 week later with the kids. And we were going to be gone for good this time. But once he went to the meeting and once he had hope, then it made sense to me to stick around and watch and see what happened. And she said, in around 6 months in recovery, I realized it was real for him. And I've been glad every day since then. And so that's, and had she left, I don't know that I would have made it. I absolutely don't believe I could do this by myself, but it's possible I could have done it without her and the kids. You know what? I don't want to play the. That's a gamble I don't want to make. And as difficult as it has been, this is an extraordinary life.
Amen to that.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a spiritual experience that you had.
Mm-hmm.
How long into recovery had you been when that experience? And you've shared it personally with me. And again, you can share as much or as little as you want to, Joe.
Oh.
You've been in recovery for a while. I guess before we get to that, how were those early, let's say 6 months to a year in recovery? What's going on internally for you?
Well, the last thing I wanted at my very first meeting was to have anything to do with this thing they call God. And I heard somebody say, and he was a man that was really helpful to me. It's a tool. Spirituality is a tool. And I thought, great. I can keep it in the toolbox. I'll carry it around with me like it's real, but I'm not having anything to do with it. And in fact, at my second meeting, which was the next day, that man had been arrested after the meeting the night before because he punched out the minister on his front steps. And I was really proud of him.
My kind of guy.
Yeah, he's my kind of guy.
All right.
He's my kind of guy. But about 3 weeks into the program, I had an experience where I went to work. I was feeling really weird physically and psychologically. I was shaky. I was sweating. Later, I think I termed it delayed withdrawal. That was probably what it was. I had no idea what it was. But I found myself in an orchard. I got out of a truck in an orchard. I was checking the orchard for insects and diseases. The orchard was out in the middle of nowhere, Leelanau County. And I couldn't get back in the truck. And I believed I was going to die here in the orchard. And I remembered at a couple meetings, people using the phrase, turn it over. Turn it over. But I didn't have any idea what they were talking about. Turn it over, turn. And I think it was turn it over to God, but I don't. What does that mean? Particularly when you don't believe in anything. And I had no intention of believing in anything. And I sort of stumbled and crawled, and because I couldn't get back in the truck, to the top of this hill, which was right on the edge of the orchard, overlooking West Bay, north of Omena, looking over Gull Island. And there was a big boulder with a sort of flat top on the edge of the orchard. And for some reason, I'm thinking it's really important for me to get to the top of the rock. To get close to, I'm trying to get closer to something that I don't believe in at all. And I get on the top of the rock, and I'm sweating, and I'm shaking. And I put my hands up in the air. Said, all right, I don't believe in you. But if you're going to help me, you better help me now, because I'm going to die here in this orchard. And I don't believe in you, but if you're going to help me, you got to help me now. And something happened. And the only way I can explain it or describe it, I can't explain it. Describe it is, it felt like somebody dumped a bucket of cool water on me, because it started with the tips of my fingers and it went down my fingers. And it felt like liquid, but it was also cool and slow. It went down my arms, went down my body to about my knees. And then it's hung there, just did this thing. And I stagger off that rock, and I'm staggering down the hill, thinking, you don't believe in anything that you can't grab with your fists. And you ask for help. And you got it. Maybe there's something there. And I thought, maybe. And then it hit me. You just prayed. Because I had a couple guys in the program who would say to me from time to time in those 3 weeks, maybe you ought to try prayer. Not me. Don't talk that crap to me. Want me to punch you in the mouth? And so I had the realization, you had just prayed. You don't believe in anything. You prayed, you got an answer. Then I felt terror. And I know I'm not the only person that ever has done that when you feel like there's an answer to prayer. Terror is often what comes next. Because what went through my mind is, now you're going to get what you deserve. And my idea of what I deserved was to be tossed into the West Bay, drown. But even before I got to the truck, it hit me. You don't believe in anything. You prayed, you got an answer, you got help. That's not whatever that is not interested in giving you what you deserve. Whatever that is somehow a loving thing. And you don't believe in anything. And it worked. So earlier in our discussion, I mentioned that I experimented. And that's what I experimented with. I experimented for the next year and a half or so on praying to the power, whatever that is. And I would change my image of what the power was every 2, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. And I got help. I was staying sober. And then I really started to play with it, until, in my mind, the ultimate playing with it was, I had all kinds of images as the higher power, as the power, as God. Until I decided I was having trouble concentrating when I prayed. So maybe I needed an image that was easier to concentrate on. I thought, how about a Playboy playmate? Naked woman. It's about the most offensive to the idea of God that I could think of. So I did that. Still got answered prayer. Then it hit me. Okay, whatever this power is, it doesn't care what your image of it is. It only cares that you use it. And that has stayed with me for over 40 years. You know? So that I don't play around with it like I used to. But I don't feel obligated to make it sound like everybody else's image. I know, for me, I know it's real, and I know whatever it is, it's loving. And it's beyond my ability to understand it. And I don't feel obligated to make it match other people's. So that has stayed with me for
That's incredible.
all those years.
Now, I'm really glad we didn't start with that.
Yeah.
The reason is there's a number of listeners out there right now that just listened to that statement of a Playboy centerfold, and they're so offended that they stop listening to everything. How could this possibly be? And Joe, in clarification, you're not saying do that.
No.
What I hear you saying is that's the audaciousness of you and how God wired you, and in testing God and trying to find out if this is real, what he needed to teach you was consistency, that my love is constant, that this thing that I believe is the cure for all of our ailments is unconditional love. It's what we really crave, each and every one of us. For us to judge how God chooses to show unconditional love to someone else is so disrespectful. So the admonition that you just gave us of I was playing around with this, trying to figure out if it was real. That's a hard fought faith, if you understand what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And I have more of an appreciation for that hard fought faith than I do just kind of this accepting, go along. You know, I grew up in a Christian home, and those are wonderful things too. But that faith that's very hard fought sometimes can be such an asset in one area, and that is to reach others. I really believe that, because I think that the thing that scares people so much about church, and a lot of people are deathly afraid of church, is that they're going to have to become like us, right? That was my desperate fear all along. So to hear this story, for those of you who may have felt almost embarrassed by hearing that, and first of all, there's courage that Joe had to share that, and I believe that the personal part of his story is the thing that's going to speak to someone out there that you or I could never speak to, and that's how God works. He is. None of us are unique, and yet all of us are unique. There's a paradox in that. We all suffer the same thing called sin, and we all are prideful critters. And yet he created us and knit us in our mother's womb. And I think that he did that artfully. And so I so love hearing more unusual stories like yours. Because that's how God wired me as well.
Yeah.
So anyways, I know we're running a little bit low on time. We have to do a second on this because I really want to go into the journey into the faith in our next one.
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay.
So no, I I think my takeaway from that and my experience speaking with and hearing, being blessed to hear the stories of many people in recovery, you are not too far gone for the God of the universe to reach you. You don't need to have your theology degree from Moody for God to reach you, to be able to cry out for help and for God to reach you. He's not interested in you having your life all put together before you come to him. And I have heard more stories of that nature that have impacted people's lives in such a profound way, where they were on that edge. They were to that point. They were locked up. They were in horrible situations. And the only prayer they had was help. I don't even believe in you. But if you're there, help. And those prayers have been answered. And there's having heard, the church ghetto term for that is the personal testimony. This is my experience with God. This was the spiritual experience I had. Nobody gets to take that away from anybody. And I've been able to meet so many people and hear that, they weren't going to church, but they cried out. And they know that they know that they know that they know that something was there. So you're not too far gone. You're not too far gone. So yeah, we're gonna have to do this again.
Yeah,
there's a lot.
Joe, would you be willing to come back?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
At some point.
Yeah, and we don't want to make it too far down the road, because I know there's going to be people that are going to be anxious to hear the next part of the story. And I'm really thinking about your journey to Jesus, not your journey to a church.
Mhm.
And my wife actually provided me with a couple of questions that I want to ask for next time. And Joe, how long do you think you said it was about 8 years maybe that you were sober when you were at the treatment center?
No.
How many years had you been?
Well, I went to the treatment center after 3 years. I mean, I started to work at Munson 3 years in recovery.
Okay.
And then I was at Munson for 9 years.
Okay. So I want to end on this from my side is the last thing I wanted was any God stuff. I was tired of that for a variety of selfish reasons. And there was this trick move that you pulled. And the trick move was is that Joe's going to hold a Sunday service on Sunday at the treatment center. And it was very limited amount of time, Ben, that I could see my wife. And but she could come for that. So it was like, I get another hour with Heidi. And it's even though you're surrounded and the activity is insane, and you're drained most of the time, I was very lonely and wanted some level of comfort. And so, my wife, so we go to this church in treatment, and I'm pissed because it's church. It's like, why can't you just give us some time together, right? So we go and we sit down, and I don't know, there's like 8 of us, maybe, from all walks of life, just crazy freaking people, really freaking crazy. And Joe does this little service, and then we sing. And Joe, do not take offense at this. You do not have the most perfect singing voice on the planet. But he would lead out loud, and we have no music. I mean, we're just sitting on metal chairs in a circle, basically, in this white room. And it was, I love you, Lord, and I worship you. And I hated the song. And then it was over too fast. And then there's another one coming. And so I did that 4 times while I was there. Since then, because I couldn't admit it then, I saw what church really was for the very first time in my life. And it wasn't that it wasn't presented to me before, because it was, but I couldn't accept it. And that was the very first time I knew what church meant. It There's a bunch of jacked up, wicked people at their wits' end that don't have it together, and a guy who's been through the same thing, who found this person called Jesus, and he's going to help us learn a song. That's what I took out of it. But there was an encouragement that I had, and it wasn't just because I got to see Heidi. That was very important, but it was because there was a submission to God. That's what it's like, that's what submission for me began to mean, was like I could actually humble myself enough to mumble because I didn't have enough self-confidence along with a song. Probably 2 months ago, Victoria sang that song. And I'm in the very back, and I have my iPad open because I'm going to be back up. And that was the one, I think it was the closing song. And I just, I just got tears coming down, because that for me is the most profound worship song, because it's the first one I ever sang. And Joe taught me what church should be. And so I think that bears us heading into the next podcast, when we are able to have Joe back. I want to delve into that a little deeper with you. And I think our audience would really, really like to hear that. So, Ben, what do we do next? I don't know how to close this
Well,
out.
we're supposed to talk about all the things that we like, something about Dublin General Store and trying to get free brats from them and all that. And that seems a little ludicrous at this time. So
Okay.
I think what we're going to do is we're going to say, Joe, thank you for being here. Thank you for being my friend. Thank you for the time that you intentionally spend with me and our staff here, for the little lessons that I learn along the way from you. Really appreciate you, you and Linda, and the rest of your family as well.
Yeah.
You guys have a very special place in my heart, my family's heart.
Here as well. Joe, I love you and I'm proud of you.
So with that, Tabernacle family, thank you for listening today. As always, if you feel so inclined, you can like, subscribe, do any of that stuff that you're able to do on all the different platforms. I don't know what they all are. Britton will fill you in better later on. If you have any questions about it, feel free to email him. He will tell you what to do to support the podcast. But we're grateful to have you with us. And until next time, this is Joe, Tim, and Ben out of here.